Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to talk at this wonderful, innovative Multi-Scapes conference. My name's Carol Smith, and I'm a soil scientist here at Lincoln University. In fact, I'm the head of department of soil and physical sciences, and I'm really a pedologist. So I look at the genesis and classification of soil, and I also have an interest in the role of organic matter and how we can use that to restore degraded soils. I also have a background in geology and geomorphology, so I sort of work in that sort of soil landscape space. And so I'm cognizant that some of you may not be so familiar with the soils and the landscapes around Mount Grand. So in my talk, I've got a few slides to try and get you in the space of what the soils are. So perhaps should I start on one of our students, Fabiellen, who's in this session today. Some of her work has contributed to my talk as well, so I'm really glad. It signifies that it's really a whole team effort that we're doing here, especially because we're working in that holistic space. So it's really important to get lots of disciplines working together. So I'm really excited to present some provisional findings today. Little icon there. Okay, so the title of my talk is Adapting to Environmental Change, Using Soil Sustainability and Resilience Concepts to Support Future Land Management Practice. In fact, this is one of Fabi's pictures, and it gives you a sense of the landscape we're working in. Mount Grand is incredibly steep hill country, and as we'll see as we go through the talk, it's some of those challenges are just the topography really are quite intrinsic when we think about, soil sustainability in this landscape. And so my co-author Sudeepa, she did a lot really of the remote sensing and the sort of manipulating the GIS material. Obviously Pablo has been working with this. Fabiellen has been working a very similar line, and also Wendy McWilliam, who's involved with some of the early design concepts. Okay, so as I said, I'm an unashamed soil scientist. So to me, soils are really important. They sit at the heart of everything we do. Really, tying in with what John Barnes was saying about the really important and obviously climate and geology tie in with soil. But it's really, this is with the system we're working in with this research here. We're talking about that link between the paddocks, the animals, and the food system and the soil. But the reason soil is so important, because soil sits at that interface of all these other spheres. It's the intersection of the atmosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, and the hydrosphere. So it's really, to me, it's really central, to our civilization. So let's just find out where Mount Grand is. So this is the South Island of New Zealand, a bit zoomed in. So Christchurch is up here, and Queenstown is down here, and this is area of Lake Wanaka, Lake Hawea. We just zoom in, we can see here that there's really not much of Mount Grand on the flats here. It's mainly up in this hill country. So we can see it's actually really quite a rugged part of the world. We can see here Wanaka, but you can see this landscape is dominated by uplifted mountains and these sort of flat landscapes as well. So we zoom a little bit more, we can see, so these red lines, these are effectively the boundary lines of the paddocks. So we can see some of these flat areas on here, on the eastern side, but most of it is in this very high hill country. And this just gives you an idea of the elevation. We're talking of elevations going from about 300 meters above sea level down here up to about 1,500 meters. So there's a huge variety of elevation. And if we're actually going to talk the numbers, so we're talking about going up to maximum altitude about 1,400 meters, and annual rainfall of about 520. So it's actually not that wet. And there isn't much variation in rainfall with altitude or aspects. So the rainfall is pretty constant, but the soil temperature is quite a key one. It can fall below 10 degrees C in mid-March, early April, so that's autumn time. And we do obviously get that lapse rate going on, that the temperature will drop with altitude. So we're actually talking about quite a challenging climatic environment in terms of low rainfall, low temperatures, high elevation, steep slopes. So that's going to have quite a key impact in terms of how this land is used and the productivity. Okay, so I said I was a little bit of a geologist and geomorphologist. So just to give you a little bit, for those of you not familiar with this part of the world, and to understand why do we get these big uplifted mountain areas. And so the basement rocks in this part of New Zealand are made up of a grey wacky rock, so that's like an indurated sandstone, dominated by quartz and feldspar. So there's not much base cations in these rocks when they weather out. They're mainly quartz and feldspar, so highly siliceous. And what happened is about before 80 million years ago, this landscape was wearing down and forming what we call a sort of a planation surface. And after that sort of the New Zealand landmass separated from Gondwana, that sort of landmass started to sink, and we're getting this wearing down and then covered by the sea and coastal erosion, and a lot of more erodible materials deposited. And then with the most recent period of mountain building, which we call the Kaikoura orogeny, that last 25 million years, which was responsible for the Southern Alps, that basement rock was uplifted. And part of that was overlain by some of these marine sediments. And so what we see today is quite a sort of a distinct landscape. So this part here, this is really where Mount Grand is. That's Wanaka here, Lake Wanaka, Lake Hawea. And we can see that this erosion, what we call the Waipunamu erosion surface, this is the uplifted schists. Okay, so we've got schists which are rich in quartz and feldspar. We have some material that's been eroded off the sides that sort of sit around here. And then in these flat valley areas, these are the areas which are effectively covered by glacial outwash surfaces. So the key thing here, Mount Grand, is the basement rock. The parent material is schist, and when that weathers, doesn't release a lot of minerals. So there's not much minerals going into the secondary weathering products in this landscape. Okay, so that's the sort of the background geology or the underlying geology. I'm a soil scientist, let's talk about the soil. So we have sort of really two main groups of soils. We have a group of brown soils, and so they're sort of similar to the Distrokrepes insectisols in the US taxonomy, and they sort of sit on this side. So where's it got 1 and 2 here? So this is, again, this is the boundary of Mount Grand, and on this western area, we have brown soils. So these are soils which are, we find they're actually a very common type of soil. They're about 42% of soils in New Zealand are brown soils. And the characteristics of this, I want to spend a little bit of time just explain the different types of soils. It's quite important when we talk about how this landscape is used, is that the weathering products of secondary aluminium and iron oxides, they're distributed evenly throughout the profile, and they coat the clay minerals and form bridges to the soil humus particles. So they're evenly distributed, so we get this uniform brown color. They're well drained, there's no glaying in these ones, they're biologically active, they've got very stable topsoils, and but the actual parent material is actually quite weakly weathered. Remember, this isn't a high leaching environment, and the base saturation is moderate to low. Now these, I'll just mention that actually if you're interested in New Zealand soils, and there's a new book that's just come out by Hewitt et al. Called Soils of Aotearoa New Zealand, and it's a brand new book this year, and this is where these illustrations are from. So we've got two different types of soils. On the sort of just tucking in here on the very west, we've got the carrick soils, and these are shallow, weakly weathered, prone to erosion. So again, this idea that there's some sort of topographic climatic factors coming into soils is really important. But most of these ones here, the Dunstan soils, as we'll see later on, there's not a lot of production going on in this part of Mount Grand. These are steep slopes. There's a little bit of loess, and we'll come on to loess in a minute, weakly weathered, but they are, these ones are particularly a little bit more leached at these high elevations. So that's the brown soils, which are equivalent to the Distrokrepes. So the next bunch of soils are these palic soils, and these are the ones 4 and 5, these green coloured ones. So these are soils which have a significant component of loess in them. So that's windblown silt-sized deposits. So those are derived from the glacial outwash plains from the receding glaciers, which are all around Lake Hawi and those lowland areas, and which are sort of up in this area where my cursor is. So you can see that they've been preferentially, with the northwest winds, being deposited on this part of the landscape. So these palic soils have quite a different characteristic. These are equivalent to alphisols and inceptisols, and they're derived from the loess, which again is derived from quartz feldspar material, so the low in base cations. They're also low in secondary ion oxides. They're actually prone to slaking and dispersion, so some of that sort of erosion aspects are quite important, and they're quite pale colours, as you can see here. They have a simple AP BW horizon, so a horizon general weathering. Sometimes we get some accumulation of clay, so when there's enough water leaching through these soils, it transports the clay through the soils and deposited at depth, so we do get some clays. So some of these B horizons that become slowly permeable. There's less permeability here with the BT horizons, but there is quite a lot of worm activity, so the biological activity is actually quite high in these soils. But some of them ones, especially ones up here in the high areas, which are really, they're quite thin skeletal soils with a thin loess cover. So again, this issue of erosion is quite key. And these blackstone soils down here, some are shallow ones with some clay accumulation. So a different group of soils on this eastern side. In fact, this is the area which has been more, as we'll see later on, it's been a bit more production. Okay, and then this is the last couple of groupings. Up here, we've got an area which is really effectively exposed bedrock or very shallow, stony, rocky soils. So it's very incipient soil development here. I mean, we're talking about, these are the entisols up here. The limitation to plant growth or vegetation growth is the depth of soil, a little bit of an A horizon forming. But down here, right on the eastern boundary, this is where we get some alluvial fans forming between in the Piedmont zone at the foot of the mountain, where we get where effectively the flat landscape starts. We start to get fluvial recent soils. So these are more of our entisols and inceptisols, and we can still see some fluvial deposited sediments here. And again, sometimes quite a deep AP horizon. And again, a general weathering BW horizon. And these are gently moderately sloping. So there's maybe a bit of a flood risk because obviously they're formed on alluvial fan, but they are at a lower elevation, and there's a little bit more potential for productivity on these soils. So these are words from the New Zealand soil classification. As I said, these illustrations from Soils of Aotearoa, New Zealand by Hewitt et al. This year. Okay, so that's the sort of background of the soils. It's what we'd expect in this part of the world, but some of the characteristics of the soils will determine the productivity. Okay, so we talked about the geology and the soils. What have we got? So we've actually got a lot of natural spatial variability. We've got spatial variability in the soils, but also, what I'm not talking about today, we've got differences in biodiversity in the pasture species, but also quite key is the biophysical factors, the aspect, the slope, and the climate, the geology, slope angles, those are all varying as well. So that's the natural variability of the landscape. Overlaid on that is what we have been doing with the landscape. So we got different in terms of the management. So we got different pasture species, we got different types of stock at different stocking rates. We've got different approaches to nutrient management and also ecological management. So there's quite a lot going on in this landscape. So my research questions revolve around: can understanding variations in soil resilience help landowners improve their land management and support them in how we adapt to environmental change, for example, say climate change? So in other words, can we look at soil from a resilience perspective to try and help management in the future responding to those external drivers? So in other words, how can we manage land in a sustainable way? And can we improve soil resilience to be more robust? Can we sort of put some dollars in the bank to help it negate all those external drivers? Okay. So that's sort of the questions that have been driving our research. And so we're at a preliminary stage, and I'm really reporting on some first results. So really this whole idea of sustainability, resilience, adaptation to change, that's sort of the theme that's driving us today. So let's talk a little bit about soil resilience. And if we consider soils at the heart or the nexus of water, energy, and food, we're wanting to talk about soils as part of sustainable land management. In other words, a holistic approach. So moving away from a reductionist approach to just looking at one or two parameters, let's consider how soils, in conjunction with pasture management, nutrient management, stock, animal management, how can we bring that together to make a resilient soil and effectively a resilient landscape? If the landscape's resilient, then we can have sustainable use of the land. That's the key. So if we think of soil sustainability as really maintaining that functional integrity of the soil, making sure that the functions of the soil carry on working. And really, that's got to be, by definition, multifunctional. There's so many functions going on in soil. So in other words, multifunctional, the sum of the processes that sustain the soil system. So a little bit, I suppose you could draw the parallel with ecosystem services. So I've taken the perspective that how can we define soil resilience? Well, that's really the ability for soil to recover functional and structural integrity after a disturbance. So after there's been an impact on the system, how stable is that soil system? Can it recover its integrity in terms of functional ability and structural ability? So in other words, if we can use as a measure of that management sustainability, if the soil can maintain both efficiency of function and existence of function. In other words, does that function work well? And is that function present? We can use that as a measure of how sustainable our soil management. But the other really interesting thing is when you talk about sustainability, we talk about, often we look at, I guess, our land management, and correct me if I'm wrong, we often look at the short-term efficiencies. We don't necessarily look at that long-term sustainability, because the short-term efficiencies is obviously tied into production and revenue. So in other words, if you're looking at short-term efficiency, you're actually trying to optimize a small set of narrow values, which actually on a long term could lead to a loss of resilience and therefore unsustainability. So that whole, what is sustainability? And I said, I'm not a sustainability scientist, I'm a soil scientist, but I'm sort of looking at how soil science and that knowledge can contribute to understanding soil resilience. So in other words, if we want to, I'm putting it out there that, to define that soil function integrity, we need to look at several multiple factors. And that's really a lot of work has been done on this in terms of soil quality indicators and defining a minimum data set. What are the group of things that we can measure that tells us if the soil is functioning well? And so that's effectively what we've done here. We've come up with a range of soil quality indicators. All right, so I've actually taken this. There's a really wonderful paper by Ludwig et al. In Stoughton, measuring soil sustainability via soil resilience, and that previous slide idea was driven from there. And I've taken this as a basis for what we're trying to do. And so in that paper, these researchers looked at soil ecosystems and what they defined as the maximum ecological performance. So in other words, that is like, how is this system working? And they talked about that ecological performance being in different stages. In other words, different responses. And it moved between different responses by crossing over a threshold. And we know that when a system crosses a threshold, it goes into a different state. And so these are quite key. It boils down to three. So down here, this system is in response to external input, there's no consequences to the system. The soil state does not change. In other words, it's resistant to an outside external driver. It sits down here. Now, if that outside external driver causes the system to move over this threshold here, it moves into a zone where that soil state undergoes a change, but it's reversible and temporary. So it's just a little bit of a blip before it goes back to this sort of base level. So in other words, with the reversible temporary change, there may be a structural change and maybe a little bit of change in species composition, but there's no functional change. The soil is still functioning as it is. In other words, it's resilient to change. There's maybe a little bit of temporary change, but it absorbs it and it can go back to that stable state down here. Now, the issue is if that system goes over this next point, this other threshold, which is really a tipping point where there is change and it's irreversible and permanent. So in other words, you're going over a threshold and you get structural and functional collapse. I would perhaps argue it may not be collapse, it may just be moving into a different state rather than the whole soil system collapsing, the whole system breaking down. I think the soil will there'll still be functions of soil, it'll just be operating in quite an entirely different way. And so we call that like a shift in the regime. And so the basis of our work, so we've mapped, effectively we've looked at some soil quality indicators, and we've used this model to say, well, is it class 1, is it class 2, or is it class 3? And the key thing is, what do we do about the soils which we are now saying are in class 3? So that's probably one of my key questions for today is, the soils that have now shifted a regime, they're in class 3. What do we do about them? Do we maintain them as they are? Do we try and get them back to a different state? That is the question. But as I say, I'd recommend that paper. It's a really good one in terms of looking at soils and sustainability. So this is a bit of a diagram that sort of brings together the different, I guess, the soil quality indicators that we're looking at and sort of just some overall concepts. And so we can talk about different sort of parts of the soil system. We talk about the chemical parts of the system. And these are the very dynamic components we can measure. pH, total carbon, nitrogen, base saturation, CEC, nutrient status. These are ones we can analyze. These are ones that are quite dynamic. They can change quite rapidly, especially as John Barnes was saying, change with adding nutrients. That will change this component of the soil system. When we talk about the physical components of the system, some of these are ones which don't necessarily change that much or are not so dynamic. Bulk density may change with compaction and stocking rates. Soil carbon will certainly change, but that's also related to aggregate stability and the universal soil loss equation. Texture may change the addition of carbon, but there's a few things which are related together but will not change as rapidly as the chemical ones, unless you're on a very steep part of the landscape. Steep slope angles, you may get more prone to erosion. And then the biological component. Now, I have to confess that we haven't done as much work in this area, but I do recognize that it is most important. This is probably where we need the next stage, so we need to collaborate with our soil biologist colleagues to actually dive into this, because I think this is really the key, as John Barnes says, is the microbial population in terms of how they can sequester carbon is really, really key. So in terms of identifying the microbial population, what's the type of microbes, what's the diversity of that population, what sort of multi-omic markers, in other words, the different types of biological analysis, the genomes, the metabolomes, those ones, what can we measure to tell us a little bit more about the composition of the biological population and how that's changing. So another really key one here is on overlapped is that the biophysical landscape, the parent material, the soil depth, the climate, the slope angle, the slope aspect. And so the ones here that I got with stars down here, and also the externalities, these are ones, obviously climate can change, But this is the other component that we can change. We can change our soil and land management. And I'll put an arrow up here because if we change, say, the nutrient additions, that's going to change the chemical component functionality of the soil. But also, I guess there should be an arrow coming up here that improving carbon sequestration could obviously affect the physical components and also the biological. So all these factors are the factors that drive resilience and soil resilience. And yeah, so that's just the other one here. There's landscape factors, all these ones here, the geology, slope angle, that all affects these factors here. So from that, we come up with our resilience classes 1, 2, and 3. All right, so that's the background of how I see the soil sustainability resilience in Mount Grande. So there's a couple of other things of data available in New Zealand which tells us something about land use capability and land resources. So NZLRI is the New Zealand Land Resource Inventory, and that tells you nationwide coverage, what's the nature of the resources on every part of the landscape. And so we work on the principle of land use capability, and these are very broad classes for soils and landscape, shall we say, going from class 1 to class 8. Class 1 is land which you can use for no limitations. It's wonderful soil like up round Auckland of Pukeko, great for growing potatoes and market gardens. At the other end of the scale is class 8, which has very severe limitations or hazards that make it unsuitable for cropping, pasture or forestry. It could be steep, it could be thin soil cover, prone to erosion. And so down here, the legend we see here, these numbers 3, 4, 6, 7 relate to the class here. And the modifiers, so these are like the subclass. And I've just put a couple, the two that relate to here, erosion and soil physical properties. So erosion clearly means there's some problems with erosion, deposition or effects of past erosion damage, limiting production. There may also be some soil properties in the rooting zone which will affect land use capability. So it could be shallowness, stoniness, low fertility, and so on. And we can see here, if we compare that, so this is the boundary of Mount Grande. This is this area of bedrock. We can see here those areas of brown soils which are around here, they're actually severe limitations. The areas which have got a bit more production use, these class 6, has moderate limitations. So we can see actually the production of Mount Grande is related to some general overall biophysical characteristics of the landscape before we start doing anything in modifying the landscape. So as well as looking at that, we can then put it all together to come up with what we call a productivity map. What's the overall productivity of the landscape? And again, here we got the boundary of Mount Grande. This is this area of bedrock. And we can see here that a very large part of Mount Grande is actually unsuitable productivity. It's not, and even these areas which have been developed are really very low to low. So this productivity is based on two things. One is the stock carrying capacity, and also a general site index for tree plantations. So it's a very broad brush approach to productivity, but it gives you a general sense that this land is got a lot of limitations, and so it actually has to be managed in quite a careful way to ensure that it's used sustainably. So I've just noticed the time, so I'll try and move through this fairly rapidly. So these are the certainly the soil quality indices that we chose, and we chose these variables, these physical variables, and ones which are very functional. These are very dynamic, so these are a lot of the soil chemical ones, and some of these are the structural ones, which are more sort of physically based. And we split them into 3 classes. So we used the Webb and Wilson, which is a New Zealand publication when it looked at evaluating rural land and in terms of different classes. And so as a first step, we split those classes up into 3. So those where we have a regime shift, well, one's really at the extreme where you've got very severe limitations, very low, very high gravelly topsoil gravel content. So again, it's a starting point. This is a desktop exercise. Obviously, the next stage is field testing. And we also use some chemical data from Blakemore et al., which is a soil chemical testing manual that we use here in New Zealand. So these were our classes, and so we compared this with data for Mount Grand from the National Soil Database, which actually had these numbers. So in other words, we could put the data from Mount Grand again into different classes for all of Mount Grand. So first of all, we looked at the soil resilience. And so we can map things like carbon, erosion severity, altitude, and come up, score it according to these classes. Now, what you'll notice, we started off actually doing it into 4 classes because we split that middle class into 2, saying one was resilience, high or low. As we progressed our research, we realized we were probably getting too much detail in at this stage when the information is actually still very broad. So we actually then pulled that back to 3, but some of this mapping shows 4 classes. So 3 and 2 is actually class 2. And so from that, we could then derive these classes. And then the idea was you then overlay all those different layers of effectively the GIS system to give our different, start to give, what is a physical resilience of the soil. And that gave us our overall map of resilience. And clearly, this is a gradient scale. We need to then move it into those classes. So it's all about collecting data in different layers and then overlaying it. And that's the thing, how much information, how complex do we want our data to be? Do you want it really detailed? And because at the end of the day, the transfer of our information to allow effective land management is going to be on a paddock basis. And so really having this amount of detail won't necessarily add more to, in fact, it'll probably make the management more complex because you're having to do stuff over lots of little areas. Whereas if we actually resolve it down to 3 classes, it actually makes it more easily transferable knowledge for the management. And so we repeated that for the more dynamic chemical functionality to get these types of classes, and then overlay that to get a general soil resilience map, where we've got low resilience in this. This is the bedrock area, and high resilience, in fact, around some of these fan soils down here. So that was the general concept, and that's the work Sadipa did a wonderful job on. So again, resolving it down into those classes. Remember, the yellow and the green are actually now 1 class. So we can actually see that the soil is soil's here quite complex. And this is the final map. So this is a map of capability of land to support resilient soils. And so here, so we've actually we've taken out that bedrock area because that's we know that's just really, you really can't use that for any meaningful production. And so we see that a lot of this area here is actually now mapped as class 3. In other words, there's been a regime shift. This actually coincidentally relates to the paddock soils and this area too, class 2. This is where the brown soils are, and then the really resilient areas, resistance on these lower level, fan areas and on the flats down here. So we can see there's actually a large proportion of Mount Grand the soils seem to have, according to our first application of our method, have actually changed into class 3. There's been a regime shift. And so really when you talk about management on paddocks, you have to, any paddock that's got some significant amount of class 3 in it, you have to treat it as 1. And so here we go. If we compare that to the soils, we can see here, we can see our area of brown soils here, our area of paddock soils here relate to that regime shift. And if we look at that productivity map, back to that original productivity map, we can see that the areas that have been unsuitable productivity have not been, there hasn't been a lot of management on there, and there hasn't been a lot of change, I suspect. So the next stage is, with this information, is to compare it to the actual records of land management and to find that if there's any correlation. And we can see here the very low and low productivity has been managed and appears to have undergone a regime shift. And here we're just overlaying the actual blocks. And so the next stage of this, we did a SWOT analysis of each paddock, looking at all the individual numbers and where was the majority of the change. Was it class 2 or class 3? And so these paddocks here, the red stars in where we've got class 3 are regime shift, class 2 is resilient. This again is the area which is the bedrock. And so we can see it's a very broad approach that we got some regime shift on the eastern part, the more managed part of Mount Grand, but the soils are still resilient on the west. Okay, so last couple of slides then. So what were our conclusions from our work? So I like to think that we've had a desktop approach to assessing soil resilience based on those biophysical factors, looking at functional integrity and structure integrity to get a first map of resilience and regime shift. And so it's really, I see it as a starting point to evaluate the soil response to external drivers. So we found that comparing those map soils, the class 3 areas coincide with the Pallick soil order, and also that very low to low productivity, whereas the class 2 were associated with the brown soil order and that unsuitable productivity. And so I think actually the more causal relationship will be with that overall productivity class rather than the soils, although the soil order is obviously allied there as well. So we know that from Ludwig's paper that class 3, the regime shift conceptually, class 3, they've undergone an irreversible permanent change. And as I say, the next stage was just a SWOT analysis to see if each variable in each paddock, what was the allocated class. And so that provisional SWOT analysis for each paddock showed us that class 3 land, there's low carbon, low CEC and P retention, pH is moderate to low, shallow rooting depth, low profile of over water, rocky outcrops, steep slope angles between 500 to 1,000 meters of altitude, and slight to moderate erosion severity. So some of these are general physical properties of the landscape in terms of the soil, and some of these are chemical, functional, dynamic parts of the soil response. So really, these are the questions that have come out of this. I mean, first, as I said before, we do have to do now. Second stage is to test this against what we actually find in the field, and this is some of the work that Fabi is doing, and actually find out what has there been any change. We also need to look at the management records. But one of the key questions I have: has this change to class 3 regime change occurred due to management practice, or is there also some sort of natural soil processes or some sort of impact from climate? In other words, is it driven by management, or is it driven by some innate factors in the environment? And the other question is actually, okay, so we say class 3 is degraded, but are they really? Are they still able to function, or have they undergone irreversible permanent change? And so I guess one of the questions that come out of this: what do we do with these soils? Do we try and get them back into class 2? How do we actively manage them to make them more resistant to further change? So that's probably really where the next stage is. What do we do to these soils now that we've identified them, that they've changed or at risk? What is the next step?
No, that was quite wonderful, and I feel, given the complexity of the region and having visited it and having worked on it for a while, it is I don't think it quite comes across how complex some of this work is. That's an initial comment that I have, and I feel people should really keep in mind that this is very initial understandings of the area. And given how managed the South Island rangelands are, that management aspect will end up playing a really key role in, furthering where this research actually goes, right? Um, I had a quick question for you, and it could be more of a explanatory question. Is that I was, as you were talking, you said that resilience is something where the the system has an ability to recover after a disturbance, right? However, when we look across the world right now, the disturbance isn't going away, right? I
Mm,
mean, effects of climate change or the effects of land use. I mean, yes, you can say that let's change management practices, but often I would almost say that often the resilience is about living with that new disturbance, right? So living with the new social ecological system that is now in place. And so I was just wondering if like as you think about this, like how does that how does that engage with the fact that what happens when the disturbance doesn't go away, and
mm.
also that some of these disturbances are on different time scales, right? You have a climatic disturbance which could be very long term, but you could also have like stock disturbance which is more seasonal. So how do you want to maybe talk a bit more about that?
That's a great question, Ratodi, and it's so true because a lot of it comes down to timescales. Like what, and is it the human timescale or the production timescale? And probably there's two things. One is an awareness of what the impacts will have on the soil. So, in other words, to try and negate those management practices that are deleterious to soil functionality, and we only know that by research and case studies and doing that work. So it's identifying, understanding what those impacts are, and then thinking, well, actually, what do we want? What do we want to do with the soil? Do we want to try and make it productive? Do we want to retire it? Is there some other use? So in other words, make it resilient. So if it's resilient, it will, I think that's the key thing. It will then resist further changes. So then it's understanding, well, how can you make a soil more resilient? And what's the soil, what's the landscape suitable for? Like, there's no point thinking, well, we're going to, you can't put in crops if it's 30 degrees slope, so you got to have some sort of realistic expectations. So in other words, those original land capability classes are quite key. It gives you a broad indication of what you can actually do with this land, and then decide, understanding how soils can be impacted. So doing that research and then saying, well, actually, what do we want? How can we make them more resilient? So, and I think it actually, to be honest, it boils down to getting more carbon in the soil and microbes. And because you can't, it's not a case of just planting trees, because the actual store of carbon is greater in the soil than all the trees you can plant on top, to be honest. And
Right.
so you can either, and you can't just plant lots of cover crops and dig them in. Again, that's not possible. So it actually comes down to the microbes in this landscape, and actually comes down to getting it's that balance, that fine fraction of the soil humus. If the microbes have the right balance of nutrients, they will store carbon rather than mineralize it. So actually, there's a little bit of work that needs to be done. I think that might be the next stage of actually, doing some trials and experiments on, well, what's the balance of nutrients in this landscape we need to add to actually increase the fine fraction of soil organic matter. And I think that's probably the key in this landscape. So that's roughly, I think, answering your question there.
That's a great answer. No.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Carol.
Hi, Charles.
Clearly, there's a huge amount of work going on here, and focusing in on just one high country farm. How do you extrapolate what you're doing here to the whole of New Zealand? Because in terms of, if you've spent a lot of work doing this, there's presumably not the resources to do this for every kind of high country farm in New Zealand.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Charles. I mean, I think the soil quality indicators we chose were based on, Webb and Wilson's work in terms of rural land evaluation. So some of those ones are applicable to all rural land, and we've obviously used the National Soil Database for data, and so we probably, there's criteria in there for salinity, which obviously isn't a problem in Mount Grand, but maybe in other areas. So I think we probably could have a go at trying to extrapolate across the country, but obviously that's a big exercise. I think what we want to try and do is let's try use Mount Grand as a case study and say, well, actually, does this approach work here? I mean, there's a lot of work on soil quality indicators, as you know, the Cindy work that we do here in New Zealand in terms of assessing indices. So that's grounded in a lot of those things which we know work elsewhere. So conceptually, at a high level, I think it could work. But yeah, it does need to apply. So that's what we want to try and do. Can we apply this to other high country areas, other rural enterprises, as a bit of a test model?
If nobody else has got any comments, any more questions, I'll jump in again.
Yeah, sure.
You were talking about what do we do to start improving soil organic matter levels and soil biological activity, and you're kind of saying trees are not necessarily the answer. That's kind of not leaving a lot of options in my head, and I'm kind of thinking you count it down to manipulating pasture and possibly some nutrient inputs. So what are you thinking of in terms of how do we manage this?
Look, that comment, Charles, is very broad brush, because I know, and I said it because I know there is a perception that, so certainly on flat land, you can plant trees and fast growing species. And the thing is, it's actually a very visual thing that that carbon is accumulating, isn't it? You can't see carbon going to soil. I mean, let's be honest, it's not the most dynamic of things, but what I'm saying is, for a high country area, you can't, those steep slopes, it is very difficult to do a lot of planting. And it might, shallow soils, shallow rooting depth is actually quite challenging. So it may be in this landscape that we could try, adding the right balance of nutrients. So the microbes, as I say, are not mineralizing organic matter. They're locking it up effectively. There could be some work on using some deep-rooted crops where the roots remain in the ground, getting the carbon in that way. But again, that requires obviously a lot of input on the surface of soil and machinery or laborious hand digging. So I'm just saying specifically, for, the landscape's got to be quite key as to what type of input you do. But and so obviously the next step is to do some trials of, well, what if we planted trees? What sort? Plots of nutrient addition, soil carbon accumulation. So there is actually a range of options. Perhaps my comment about trees is a bit more to get a reaction than actually, because I think it's actually a really important debate, because I say we do have, we think, carbon, trees, end of story. When in fact, it's a bit more subtle than that, depending on the landscape you have.
Because I mean, coming from an ecological perspective as well, you kind of start thinking about Hinaway, and you kind of go, we put the gorse and the broom seeds out there and walk away, and just let nature reclaim this stuff. Which isn't much. It's not much chop for the farming, but I mean, as you've clearly shown through your research, this land's not up for growing much in terms of productive agriculture.
Absolutely.
And in terms of facing the massive challenges we have, climate change, biodiversity loss, and all the rest of it, you kind of go, this was in native bush originally that was cut down, apart from the stuff that's obviously so steep it's permanently eroding. And you're kind of going, do we just need to put this back to native bush? And I mean, to me, the Climate Change Commission was very clear. They're saying, yes, we need to plant trees, but not many pine trees. We need to put a lot of stuff back into native vegetation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in what you say. I mean, if you think about it, that's what grew there originally, and that's a result of the intersection of the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere. I mean, that's the equilibrium point of the ecosystem. And I've been coming from a very source perspective, so I acknowledge there's a whole load of stuff around the ecology, biodiversity, the input of animals, but it might be that nature knows best. That might be the way. You say, well, it's not productive, but then makes the soil more resilient, and who knows what you might be using the soil for, that landscape for, in the future.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is kind of a bit of the kind of elephant in the room. question for the farmers is they've been farming this stuff now for several generations in many cases, and basically the stuff's worn out, and you're kind of going, okay, you've had your time, guys, time to leave.
Yeah, so you know,
that's a very difficult thing to tell to the farmers. You know, they've been farming this stuff for many years, but I mean, to me, that's really the kind of situation we've got ourselves into here. You know, in these highly erodible, fragile, you know, very young landscapes. It's kind of like, time to leave, guys. Go away.
Yeah, look, I think there's that you know, source is only one part of the equation. The social economic aspects of land use, and it may be that you have some parts which you put a certain percentage back into native vegetation, and then you have another strategy of boosting the microbial organic carbon sequestration in other parts. You know, think about the stocking rates as a whole. It's actually a whole menu of approaches you can take. I don't think it's just one thing fits all. You have to consider, as part of the bigger question, what is the social economic, what do you want out of Mount Grand?
Yeah.
That's the, is it revenue and production, or is it a resilient landscape, and can you generate revenue in some other ways from something that actually is driven from an ecological biodiversity perspective? So there's actually a whole way of, it's a much bigger discussion. You're right, and I think a lot of it will be driven by what do we want from Mount Grand. Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's interesting. You raised the issue of ecosystem services, and when I'm out talking with farmers, I kind of make the point to them, there's 25 ecosystem services. One of those is food production. Yeah. You don't get paid for the rest.
Correct.
You know, to me, as a society, even at the global level, it's kind of, well, you know, we farm this land to death now, being slightly blunt about the thing. You know, do we pay the farmers as a society to actually put this stuff back into native bush and look after it and manage it, you know, and do the predator control and all the rest of it? Mm-hmm. You know, and I use examples of Switzerland, you know, and the EU as a whole, something like 20% of farm incomes in the EU comes as direct subsidies. In Switzerland, it's 70% because they have a slightly unequal economy there, have a very large financial sector, and literally there's a whole load of financiers going, I like the guy in the leather hose with a big horn up in the mountain, pay him.
Yeah, alpenstock, yeah, that's right. So
literally, they just pay the farmers to produce the farm landscape that they want to see, and the farmers make basically no money out of farming.
Well, so I mean, it's a whole social economic aspect of it, you know.
Yeah.
But I think that, and you know, certainly when you say they farmed the place to death, that's because at that time they may not have had the knowledge of what they were doing. They thought they were doing okay because they're actually transplanting different land management practices in other parts of the world to New Zealand. So the more you can understand about how the system works and operates, the better you can manage it. That's the key thing. But I think it's got to be part of a bigger discussion. You say, what do we want from Mount Grand? Is it revenue? Is it revenue for something else? Production? You know, so it's a big question. But this is just a start. It's a really exciting holistic approach.
Right. No, thank you very much, Carol. Cheers.
Great.
Thank you both for your questions, and yeah, that was great. That was a great bit of input there, Charles.
Thank you.
One other thing, you know, before we leave, I was also thinking is that a big issue has been always with how do we include soil within carbon accounting, right? And the reality is that there's a huge amount of tree bias that is there in the world, even though soils can hold, you know, multitudes more of carbon. And as a lot of, you know, recent work has shown that a lot of the terrestrial carbon can burn up when the temperature goes up, but soils don't burn. I mean, a lot of it actually remains linked, you know, stored down below. And so grasslands and rangelands, which across the world are often under threat from encroaching trees, are actually incredible reservoirs. However, they're not often incentivized, like people are not incentivized to let them remain so, right? Like who's getting paid for retaining soil carbon?
Well, that's right. I mean, that's right, because you can actually see trees. You can't really see how much carbon's in the soil because, you know, so it's not the most dynamic and attractive of things. It's brown. It just sits there. You know, but trees have aesthetic value. They have biodiversity value. You know, there's biodiversity in the soil as well. So there's quite a conversation and education we have to go through to actually say, hey, well, actually, we could do it like this. And I think actually it's going to be not just one solution. It's going to be a range of solutions. It will be trees. It will be native bush. It will be some carefully managed pasture to bring in a little bit of perhaps some animal production, but at a low stocking rates. You know, it'll be a mixture of those, I think.